Scarbs, the pleasant news from Austin, the only pleasant news at the moment, given the rain we got, is that there are a surprising number of technical changes to the cars, which we didn't really see coming.
No, not at all. I mean, I really thought this weekend was going to be a chance just for me to kind of consolidate and looking at all of the changes that we'd seen in previous races. But in fact, nearly every car, or as I've been explaining, probably nearly every team that have got some money left, have got new parts on the cars. And surprisingly, everyone's converging on all very similar solutions. There's nothing completely new out there, but we've seen lots of other people taking ideas from other teams and applying it to their cars.
Well, let's look at the team that has the best car at the moment, and obviously every time they touch that, they're wondering, are we going to go backwards at all? Hopefully we're going forwards. They seem to know what they're doing. Obviously, Mercedes, what do we see on that car?
Well, with Mercedes, the main change is on Nico Rosberg's car, and I'm thinking this may be some precursor to Mexico. What they've done is they've changed the cooling setup very slightly on the car, and they've added a couple of roll hoop inlets around the roll hoop to either side, and a duct which feeds right all the way down the back of the engine cover to a little oil cooler which is mounted, a new oil cooler which is mounted right at the very back of the bodywork. It appears this is probably to do with the gearbox, judging by its size, but it could be ERS. I need to have a closer look. And this duct is, uniquely feeding this cooler. So my gut feel is that they're thinking about Mexico, where you want to maximise engine power, you want to maximise cooling because of the altitude and the thin air, and by having the engine air inlet solely focused on feeding the engine, and then you've got these supplementary things cooling other parts. It's the best of both worlds. They're getting the maximum power out of the engine, and they're making sure it's reliable at the same time.
I can understand why they would run that in a simulator. It seems a little bit strange. I know it's a double header, I know it's next weekend, but it's a little bit strange to be running it in the low altitude density of Austin, though. How much could they actually learn relative, if it is indeed a precursor to Mexico?
Well, they'll be able to read the temperature deltas. So Hamilton's car's running a completely conventional setup, so they'll get the temperatures there. They'll see the temperatures that are running on Rosberg's car, and the difference tells them the advantage they're going to get potentially both on the engine power and on the cooling. So they will get some data. It won't tell them that they'll have more than enough cooling in Mexico, but it is they're so far ahead of the curve of everyone else. They can be doing all of this quite diligent preparatory work ahead of time to make sure that they don't get caught out at Mexico. But probably by then I think the World Championships will be a moot point anyway. But
just to continue the Mexican theme for a second, the high altitude, the thin air, what impact is that going to have on aerodynamic setup for the circuit?
Well, thinner air means you have less mass going over your wings, which means you get less downforce. Of course, the effect is the same for all of the teams, but in order to get the best out of the car, they'll need to run slightly higher wing angles than they would have to if they were down at sea level. We've seen the circuit. There are some fairly challenging corners there, so it certainly isn't going to be a low downforce track. All of the tracks nowadays tend to be very, very low downforce or high downforce. There's very few tracks that kind of float around in the middle now, so we expect teams to be running fairly significant amounts of wing for the Mexican race.
And just to finish off with Mercedes, we now know that Nico Rosberg's problem in Russia was caused by a broken throttle damper, which, quite interesting. Not all the teams run throttle dampers, and if you can explain where that's located, what its purpose is, and why some teams don't run them. I presume they're just running very stiff springs instead, but now we know what failed, and we understand it was a lifing failure more than anything else. They've never had a problem before with the throttle damper, and I guess that'll never happen again either. But interesting that Singapore Grand Prix, Lewis had similar symptoms to Nico, completely different problems on the car.
Yeah, it's strange. Lewis's problem in Singapore was a problem with a clamp on the turbo housing, which caused problems in getting full throttle. It was a kind of a secondary failure, as you were. It wasn't the pedal itself. But with Nico's pedal, what happened? If we think of most road cars, or even most racing cars, particularly if you're running carburetors and throttle bodies, you have a spring that snaps the throttle shut, and with the cable that then brings the pedal back to its resting position up the front of its travel. Formula One cars have got accelerated by wire, so they've got no physical Bowden cable between that and the engine. So what they have is the pedal just pivots freely on its bearings, And then between the pedal and the chassis somewhere is a little telescopic setup, which, as you say, for most teams is just a very stiff spring. I mean, I've pushed these pedals. It's more like a clutch pedal on an old car than it is a throttle pedal on a new car. You need quite a bit of pressure to get these springs to compress. That's so that the driver can modulate the throttle where they're in, high G corners, and they're not, bouncing up and down unnaturally on the throttle. Some teams then, as well as springs, put a damper into the process just so that you're not getting too much bounce in the pedal because of the spring. Sometimes this is just a simple friction damper, sometimes it can be an oil-type damper, which I understand is what that Mercedes have, an oil-type damper, almost like a little shock absorber with a spring attached to the pedal. That appeared to fail. It sounded like it came apart because the pedal actually, rather than just coming back to its normal resting position, it was actually coming all the way back into the footwell, and Nico was having to lift his leg right off of the pedal to get it to come all the way out in order for it to zero until the engine, the driver's foot is off the throttle for turning the engine off. And it's not something you can drive with it in that situation, and eventually probably it would have failed completely and it would just been a pedal flapping around inside the footwell. So unusual failure. I've never heard of anything quite like that before, but it just goes to show that parts that teams have had on the cars for hundreds of races can eventually fail, and you've got to keep an eye out for this stuff.
You say it's quite small. How small is it?
It's probably a couple. If you put your two fingers together, it's probably that sort of length, that sort of thickness. Some teams go for slightly bigger springs. I think it depends, how much spring you need to put into it. But they're the sort of pen size sort of piece of equipment.
We're expecting quite a lot of Williams as the season winds down now.
Yes, I mean, I think Williams are not tackling their problems by strapping lots of new bits to the car. They have got a revised front wing specification here, which again is just an evolution of what we've seen before. Nothing outrageous about that. But we know they've not been very good in wet conditions. We know that they haven't maybe got on top of the strategy in some of the aspects of car setup, particularly related to tyres, and they've been working very closely internally with this, and perhaps maybe some of the physical changes we've seen on the car this weekend is related to maybe trying to get a bit more downforce into the car to get the tyres working in every possible situation. So it's a fairly challenging weekend for the team this weekend.
So what apart from the reprofiled front wing, what have they got on the car?
Well, much of the rest of the car looks the same. I did notice after the first run when Felipe came back into the pits, there was maybe not a fire, but some very, very hot bodywork which required some extinguishers and some air guns being blown over it to stop the bodywork burning, which suggested they have done some changes around the back of the car, around the exhaust area it seems. Maybe they've tucked the side pods in a bit tighter than they did before. Maybe they've changed the heat shields around the engine. So there are little details that are going on around that car this weekend as well.
We saw them also running in the wet in Russia. They went out and they're actually quite quick, both Massa and Bottas quick in the wet, as you say, underlining Williams' approach of let's work out why we haven't been good in the wet. And I think they took that decision after the British Grand Prix around that time. They've been working systematically towards that. But just to go back to what you thought was the fire and the smoke on the back of the Williams, this brings us to another theme which you and I have talked about, which is that many of the teams will be looking to make the cars more compact. For 2016, so we're going to see a bit more of this overheating probably as development continues.
Yes, well, this 2016 is going to be the third year of the current engine formula, and we've seen the massive steps, particularly with teams like Ferrari and Red Bull, that really reduced the size and the shape of their side pods from 2014 through to this year. I think teams are going to make another big step, and they're getting to understand where the heat is on these new power units, and they're tucking things in very, very tightly. And yeah, I mean, I think certainly, those two key pre-season tests next spring is really going to have a lot of situations where we can have not fires, but again, smoking bodywork, and it's a bit of concern in the garages.
Force India, lots of pressure on Sergio Perez to continue the momentum. Third place in Russia, the car looking pretty good. What are they doing?
They have. It's strange. We've seen the car develop through the year, particularly the big Silverstone upgrade, and then a couple of other sort of more significant upgrades as well since that point. This weekend they've got another front wing specification. They've actually got all three of their wings out in the pit lane, and they're flicking between them during free practice, finding out which ones are working. The new one is, again, very Red Bull-like. There's lots of very Red Bull-like influences around this car. I know they've taken some staff from Red Bull to run their wind tunnel program, which of course is now over in the Toyota facility in Cologne. Still on the 50% wind tunnel model, not gone up to 60% yet. They're trying to see where the rules are going. But this program is delivering, and we can see that's a really solid little race car now that they've got these updates. It's put a bit of pace back into the car. You know, you've got someone like Perez that can really manage his tyres in his race very well, and obviously Hulkenberg just with, you know, his natural pace, really bringing out, you know, the qualities of that car, and they're looking very good in the championship now.